What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, brother? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing okay. I'm sorry for the technical difficulty. I don't know if you're going to put this into the show or not, but we spent the last 5 minutes. Danny has spent the past 5 minutes giving me a crash course on stuff I probably should have known for the past 3 years because I just can't figure out basic microphone settings. Every single knob I press on this microphone just screws everything up, just messes everything up instantly. There's like these different settings on this microphone. Every single button I press, like, just, it will change my voice. I miss the good old days when I had a $30 USB mic from
Buttonless.
Amazon. What was it, the Blue Snowball?
Yeah, that's what we started with.
And you know what? We used that microphone for maybe 2 years. Both of us. We had the same one.
That's right.
$30. And that thing lasted. That thing was a champ. It did everything
really
that you needed the microphone to do. It wasn't like the best, most sophisticated recording mic. However, it definitely got the job done. It was a workhorse of a mic, and it was.
Yeah, it certainly was. For context, though, Henry's dealing with one button and one dial, and it's tripping him up. So, we got to ease him into these things.
Yeah, technology is definitely not my thing. Well, thanks for joining us on Barack Obama's birthday. Today is
Happy
August
birthday,
4th, and it is Barack Obama's 60th birthday. They are celebrating his birthday by bulldozing an entire Chicago neighborhood for his presidential library. And I think that they're probably... Let me ask you something. Do you think that they're doing like any type of human sacrifice, or are they just doing like animal sacrifice there?
I think just animals this time around.
Just
with
animals?
COVID-19, they don't want to risk getting the virus or anything like that from the blood splatter or anything like that. So
if there was ever a place where there was human sacrifice going on, I would imagine it would be Barack Obama's birthday. There would be some type of weird apocalypto style blood sacrifice that would have to be made to the demon lords who control our fate. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, not Barack Obama. He's not a saint, but I don't really get that vibe from him.
Well, I think just the whole
more
crew
like,
there celebrating Barack Obama's birthday. I think they're
more
definitely
like
into
Rupert
human
Murdoch
sacrifice.
or something like that, or like just someone more sinister looking. Not a puppet. That's different.
Well, I think they're all just there eating people. They have like a cage full of people from, a developing country, and they're just going to town, and that's how they get their kicks. That's how I imagine. I think a big portion of society, I would say maybe at least 30%, thinks that's actually viable, that they're eating people. They're trafficking people, and the elites are eating and raping people. And
I don't know. I think
them.
that stat is reserved for lizard people. I think 30% of people think lizard people are real. I don't know if 30% of people think that that other human beings are eating human beings.
I understand the concept of lizard people sounds very goofy, and no, I don't actually believe that there's lizard people like in the movie V. Have you ever seen that movie V? I've talked about it on the show.
No, you keep telling me to watch it. I gotta pick it up one day.
It's an old TV movie from, I think, the 80s or 70s or 80s. It's a TV sci-fi series. It's a miniseries, and it's about these aliens that take over Earth, and they look human, but their true selves is they're like these humanoid lizards. And that's what I kind of imagine what the lizard people are actually like, what they look like. That's my point of reference for them. But no, I don't actually believe in lizard people. I just call the super mega powerful of the world lizard people. And we're going to be talking about some lizard people today, but I guess maybe not modern lizard people, some older lizard people,
some
historic lizard people. But I guess we should start this episode by going back to our episode on WikiLeaks we did last week. By the way, it's Thursday, so this will be released on a Sunday, so we're about 4 days behind when we're actually releasing this. But last week we were talking about Julian Assange and the assault on the free press and civil liberties, and also investigative journalism. And basically, the conclusion that I came to, and I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like you kind of agreed with this, that the precedent is being set that if you leak or publish classified materials, you can be put in jail.
Yep. Can agree.
And right now, Assange is being indicted for violating the Espionage Act. And, to go back, the Espionage Act was proposed by Woodrow Wilson during World War I, and it had the explicit intention to restrict anti-war criticism. And, I was just thinking to myself, this was a very tyrannical time in U.S. history. And, the more I thought about it, and, I'll put this back into modern context, due to a lot of, things like government lockdowns, New York is basically going to have a COVID passport system, NSA surveillance, big tech censorship. There's certainly an argument that people are making that we have never been less free.
Yeah, I very much disagree with that. I mean, there are so many instances, in our history where we've been very much less free than today. Few examples coming to mind. Very obviously, slavery comes to mind. Can't be less free than slaves. But also Jim Crow laws, segregation. There have been targeted immigration policies that specifically, go after specific ethnic groups, and that still persists even to today. Well, there was Japanese internment camps, so, the Japanese people during that time definitely weren't free. Well, we had the prohibition of alcohol, so we weren't free to drink. There was McCarthyism in the 50s, right? So, basically you can snitch on your friends and say that they were commies, and McCarthy's gonna come after you. More contemporary example, anyone who's gay couldn't get married in the past and can now. So gay people are free to marry whomever they like at this point. And what we'll discuss later, the Sedition Act, which was around until at least 1920. I think what you mean to say here is that specific freedoms are being repressed in our current society, but I think we'd need to define what those freedoms or which freedoms we mean. Otherwise, I totally can't stand behind the assertion that we're somehow blatantly less free now than we ever have been, because that's just patently not true for so many liberties and so many different peoples.
Well, that wasn't the point I was trying to make. The point I was trying to make is that there's certainly the argument that right now in society we are people are making the argument we are the least free than we ever been as Americans.
And I think they're being superficial about it. So that's my assertion. I'd agree that certain liberties might be going up or down, but I don't like the blanket assertion that we're somehow less free, because we aren't, in my opinion. All right.
And I agree with you. And what I think is that our liberties in America are kind of like the stock market. So there's peaks that go up, and there's and then there's downs. And
on that point, I think we can agree. They definitely
it goes ups and it goes. It's not a slope. It didn't. There's not one gradual slope starting from 1776 that continued just to go down with every year passing,
or up for that matter.
There have been times in our country that have been extremely oppressive, and then things get better, but then things get worse, but then better, then worse. So, I think putting more history into context, you can see that there's been some pretty awful infringements on civil liberties, even before today, even before, the modern national security state that came to be after 9/11. And I think that's kind of a white pill in a way, because, since 9/11, we've been on this real big downturn in terms of civil liberties. But I think maybe it can go back up. Maybe that can increase.
I mean, again, I still think that you're painting with a pretty broad brush here. We'd have to specifically say, which civil liberties are we going down on?
Of course, yeah, you're right. I am painting with a very broad brush, and I'm trying to paint with a very broad brush because obviously it's more complex. There's different liberties, and there's different things, and there's different freedoms that are kind of given and taken away throughout society. But what I want to focus on today to kind of put this into a greater context is Woodrow Wilson, the President Woodrow Wilson, and the federal government, and basically what society was like during the war periods, during World War I. And just to kind of lead this up, the Federal Reserve, World War I, League of Nations, the Espionage Act, the income tax, that is the legacy of Woodrow Wilson. I call him the Mad President, like the Mad King in Game of Thrones, the Mad President Woodrow Wilson. And here's a guy that in his 1916 re-election campaign, he campaigned on keeping America out of the war. But only a month after his second inauguration, he was already asking Congress for a declaration of war on Germany. It's kind of like, which is not new. A lot of presidents and a lot of presidents will campaign on more humble foreign policies, and just like George Bush and Barack Obama. I mean, if you look at George Bush, and if you hear some of his speeches before he became president,
Bush Jr. We're talking
Bush
about
Jr.
Right? Mm-hmm.
He disavowed nation building, these nation building projects, and he became, probably the greatest nation builder, or I don't want to say the greatest as in good or positive, but he
accomplished anything.
He certainly committed to the building of these nations more than probably any other president in our history.
Probably. Mm-hmm.
And
Obama
America's
was the same way,
entry.
Happy birthday to him. he was all about pulling out of the wars, and
you have the surge, and then you have, Barack Obama basically just continued George Bush's policies.
Just threw some gasoline on that fire. Mm-hmm.
But America's entry into World War I, it basically created a system of repression of dissent on these civil liberties that I think is unprecedented in at least our history. I think the only thing you really could have compared it with was when Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. So just to put this in a little bit of more context and give you some examples, he put thousands of journalists in jail.
Wilson.
He banned...
Right.
What's that? Wilson.
Wilson, right.
Woodrow Wilson. So he put thousands of journalists in jail. He banned the playing of Beethoven because he was German, a.k.a. a Hun.
I have a funny story, actually, about Beethoven. Did you know that he was black? I mean, Wilson would probably still have banned him, but it's an interesting story. So in 1907, this British composer, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, came up with this wild theory that Beethoven was black. So this guy was like mixed race. He was a white. He had a white English mother, and his father was from Sierra Leone. And the reason why he started saying that Beethoven was black was because he couldn't help but notice from all of the drawings of Beethoven that there was a lot of likenesses between his facial features and the images of Beethoven that he was seeing. Now, keep in mind, all the images of Beethoven that he was seeing were drawings. And secondly, Talk about a weird way to say, hey, you must be black because your drawings look like me in some way. And anyway, he ended up going to the South in the U.S. and he said if the greatest of all musicians were alive today, he would find it impossible to obtain hotel accommodation in certain American cities. That's what he said about the South, because Beethoven was black, according to him. And Beethoven was black became kind of a slogan for civil rights in the U.S., which is interesting for this particular conversation that we're having about civil liberties. And even Malcolm X jumped on this train. So he told an interview, like in an interview, he told one of the interviewers that Beethoven's father had been, quote, one of the blackamoors that hired themselves out in Europe as professional soldiers. Apparently there was a lot of Spanish Moors that were sellswords at the time. And this was a going theory that he was black. To be clear, he wasn't black. Beethoven wasn't black. He was definitely white. But I choose to believe that he was black just because it's more interesting that way. All right. Sorry. What else did Wilson do?
Sure. I'll take that theory. It makes sense. Beethoven was black.
Yep.
It's kind of like the race Olympics from the Chappelle Show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You ever watch that when they started drafting people from race and the Asians draft the Wu-Tang Clan, and I think who did? Oh yeah.
Didn't the black people get Eminem?
The black people drafted Tiger Woods. And he's like, for shizzle. I've always wanted to say this. For shizzle. But what else did this guy do? What else did Woodrow Wilson do? Here's something he did. He changed the name of sauerkraut to Liberty Cabbage.
Freedom fries. Just like that, right?
just like freedom fries. And the guy who spearheaded that, Walter Jones, is actually,
nothing about him.
I was a big fan of his later work. He was one of those congressmen who deeply regretted supporting the war and selling the war like that. And I think he had a real guilty conscience, and he was writing letters to the families of dead soldiers. So it shows how you can change over time. But yes, embarrassingly enough, he pushed. I don't know if he came up with it, but he certainly was the guy to go on probably either Sean Hannity or Bill O'Reilly and say, boycott French fries as freedom fries. But yeah, this Wilson did the same thing. Sauerkraut, the Liberty Cabbage. Like
the French had nothing to do with 9/11, so I don't understand why they were attacking French fries.
Because the French were saying, hey, like all these foreign escapades that you're about to do are not a good idea. And we were like, you French, we saved your ass in World War II. Rabble. But some other things is he tried to prohibit the teaching of German in public schools.
I take personal offense to that.
Well, yeah, because you speak fluent German, right?
That's right. Studied it for like 14 years.
Fun fact, Danny speaks German.
And Spanish.
3 languages.
That's right.
Then what else? Oh yeah, he basically created a domestic spying campaign on dissenters and German Americans. He supported like these super patriot groups that would also like spy on citizens, and his administration created a propaganda. I'm sorry.
What was that, like the Proud Boys of their day?
I mean, or maybe. The Antifa, whatever if you're a liberal or a conservative, whatever group you want to throw underneath the bus. But yeah, he tacitly supported these kind of super nationalist groups to put down dissent as basically an arm in the government. And we'll put a pin in that because I do want to actually talk about that.
Okay.
But I have a quote from Murray Rothbard, and I think some of you guys who listen to the show, gals, are kind of weirdo libertarians like myself. I kind of keep it a little private, but sometimes it does come out. But I have a quote that I felt was pretty strong from him. The period of the First World War was a watershed in the evolution of the corporate liberal warfare state. It saw the beginning not only of the government-business alliance and industry and American militarism and globalism, but also of the ideology and apparatus of the national security state. In the years in crisis to come, the threats to civil liberties would be systemized as the latest depredations by the CIA, FBI, and other federal agencies show these have far from disappeared. Which I think is a very fair, not only prediction, but analysis of that administration and how it impacts the world today. I think he wrote this in the 1980s. Now, going back to like World War I, basically all wars are by deception in some way. There's always a campaign to sell wars. Just like the Bush administration lied us into war in Iraq, just like about how every president lied us into war in Vietnam, going back to Harry Truman. But I guess most notably, the most egregious lies were probably told by President Johnson and Robert McNamara.
Right.
But, the modern memory of the U.S. rushing into the war just before the British and the French were about to fold to quote unquote save democracy doesn't really reflect reality, nor even does it reflect public opinion at the time, or at least public opinion after the war in the 1920s and 1930s. A lot of Americans believe that entering this war had been a huge mistake. I just think about the damage that took place. 115,000 soldiers, American soldiers, died. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded. And that was only in 200 days of combat.
Nuts.
These guys were getting just slaughtered. Because a lot of the soldiers going into the war were green. A lot of the American soldiers they're fighting these grizzled combat vets who had been fighting since 1914. So a lot of these guys were just sacrificed, like pigs to a slaughter.
Meat grinder, as they say.
A total meat grinder. And there was no reason why all these guys had to die. And just to compare that with World War II, I mean, that's the same rate of casualties as in World War II. And World War II had a lot of different theaters going on.
Right.
In the war, the Pacific War, obviously the Italian campaign, and the eventual invasion of Normandy. But that all took place over 4 years. This took place in 200 days. So just the rate of carnage, and a lot of people had the suspicion that the war was fought to secure private loans to allies, because even though the U.S. did remain neutral for most of the war, they were heavily supporting the Allies through bank loans. And another thing about World War I is that there really was no bad guy in this conflict. Like, it wasn't like World War II where you can say, hey, one side, the Nazis, everyone there deserved to die, at least the soldiers, or, carrying the armband. This was a lot more complicated, where it was a lot of guys. I mean, I guess you could say the same thing about World War II or any war. But, a lot of these guys, it was more of just kind of a class war. Like, these poor guys from the country or from urban areas were just being conscripted and thrown into the meat grinders.
Right.
So,
and I mean, it's more than that. I think that you could probably say that for every war. We always seem to draw on the rural, areas in the middle of nowhere and just throw them into a shitty situation. I mean, the last 20 years of war in the Middle East has basically, proven that. But, I think on your point that there was no good guy or bad guy in the conflict, the Germans did, some war crimes in Belgium, but, every side was doing that. I mean, every party in World War One was trying to scoop up additional colonial powers and like extend their empire. The Germans for sure, but Belgium had been basically doing a genocide in the Congo throughout the entire 19th century. So yeah, the Germans did some mean things to Belgium, but Belgium was also doing some pretty mean things also, and I think what was the idea, the pretext of the war was that the, German Empire had violated Belgium's neutrality. But again, they kind of threw that out the window by doing fucked up things in the Congo. And of course, the British
that's
Empire,
the pretext of war why the British joined the war. That's
right.
The pretext on paper of why they.
But it doesn't make any sense because the British had been, the British Empire, the sun never set on the British Empire at that point in time. Like they had probably the most colonies and colonization out of everyone. They weren't like the good democratic, like nice states. It's just, it just wasn't like that, So let's maybe talk a little bit about the pretext for war for America. Like, how do we get in? Because that's where Wilson pops up.
Yeah. So the pretext of the war for America was that German submarines would attack British ships, and they would sometimes kill Americans on board. The most famous being the Lusitania, which killed more than 100 Americans. But it turned out this ship, it was actually a legitimate military target. It was transporting a lot of weapons. And when the war began, the Germans, and just to pull this back, the Germans would let the passengers of these ships, these British ships, escape on lifeboats before sinking them. But the response from Winston Churchill, who was the Secretary of the Navy, or First Lord of the Admiralty, or whatever that position is, he kind of configured a plan to use decoy vessels called Q ships. And what they would do is that they would wait for German submarines to submerge, and then they would just blast them. Therefore, German naval commanders, they began to order submarines to sink these merchant ships on sight. Because
without giving them any notice, like
they would just find a merchant ship and they would sink it. And when this happened, the British used this as an opportunity to bring America into the war. There's a quote from Churchill there's a letter from Churchill that kind of completely indicts him of trying to pull America into the war using this tactic. And I have it right here. It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores, in hope especially of embroiling the United States with Germany. We want the traffic, the more the better. And if some of it gets into trouble, the better still. So, this was an active strategy to pull the U.S. into World War One.
That's fucked up.
Because he knew, Americans would die on these ships, and it would stir up anti-German
sentiment.
But so Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, he wanted to warn Americans not to travel aboard these ships. But Wilson said, he said no, like you don't. He forbid him from, issuing these warnings to, merchant marines or travelers from America to England. And when the Lusitania set sail from New York, it was secretly carrying munitions and Canadian troops in civilian clothes, which essentially made it fair game for German U-boats.
Yeah, this actually was a pretty big gamble for Germans, and I think they had to have had intelligence on this because, like you said, they ended up being right. The ship was carrying Canadian troops Although I'm not sure if they recognized that at the time, but they were able to recognize the fact that there was 1,248 cases of 3-inch artillery shells, or like almost 5,000 boxes of rifle cartridges. I'm sure when they hit that thing, it blew the fuck up. Like, it probably exploded pretty good. But in the, it's a lot of ammo, but in the grand scheme of things, it probably wasn't very much at all in the context of the war. But the point here is that the Germans ended up being right about that ship. And German diplomats in New York had even tried to warn American passengers that they were in danger on the Lusitania. But, instead of sailing north to Ireland, to Liverpool, the Lusitania evidently went south into, the waters that were known to be hunting grounds of the German U-boats. So, the Lusitania blew up and, 1,200 people were killed, including 128 Americans.
And the Wilson administration, they could have publicly warned Americans not to go on these ships. Right. And his own Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, he resigned after that. Mm-hmm. And he basically said, I don't have his exact quote, but he basically said this was insane. An insane policy to use civilian passengers to protect these warships. But, I don't blame, or I think you can make a case where the conspiratorial mind will go and say, hey, these were bait. The Wilson administration were willing participants in this.
I don't think you need to be conspiratorial to think this. They were bait. I mean, why else would Wilson not let his Secretary of State warn the public about taking, ships, or specifically that ship? How else did the Germans know that the Lusitania was packing heat? Also, why would they sail right into a U-boat territory? Jennings was legit furious about this. He was the Secretary of State, and he knew that those passengers are human body shields, and it didn't sit well with him that this administration that he was serving was like totes cool about doing that. The quote that you were looking for, by the way, Henry, he said that it was like putting women and children in front of an army, which is true. That's what they did. Because yes, there were Canadian soldiers on there, but not all of them. Certainly not all of them.
But nevertheless, the voice of reason in Wilson's cabinet ends up resigning over this. Right. And it kind of just leaves the door wide open for the war. So, and just to obviously note something that did happen is that Germany does declare unrestricted submarine warfare on ships bound for Britain and France. And they do send a telegram to Mexico to try and get them into the war on the side of Germany in exchange for lost provinces. So like Texas, Arizona, provinces that were lost in the Mexican-American War. But just like think about how ridiculous that is. Like how that could be considered an actual threat. Like imagine even in the early 20th century, before the United States sat on top of the New World Order, that would be insane.
Weren't they planning on offering up like Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona back to Mexico? Could you imagine that? Like, good luck.
Yeah, good luck.
Good luck getting Texans to be Mexicans.
And the truth is, the Zimmerman telegram, and that's something that we learn when we're younger. I remember learning that when I was, 6th, 7th grade, social studies, the Zimmerman telegram. And that was taught as why it was justified for the U.S. to enter the war, because Germany was trying to get Mexico to invade us. But, that was a telegram that was intercepted. It was an intercepted message from Berlin to the German ambassador in Washington. And it was intercepted by the British. The British, who had a clear incentive to try to sell America into that war. And, what the Zimmerman telegram actually said and it was basically more of a telegram saying, hey, if the U.S. does enter the war against us, if they join the side of the Allies, because they basically were financially supporting the Allies anyway, then if you join the war on our side, when we negotiate a peace, we will barter for those lost territories that were lost decades ago. That's what the Zimmerman telegram was. It wasn't like, hey, you go invade America as our
right. But I mean,
as our
tacitly,
occupying
though,
force.
I can't imagine. Like, imagine if that played out for a moment. It would be like, all right, so U.S. joins the war on the Allied side, and then this message actually did make its way to, the German ambassador in Washington, who somehow manages to get it down to. Was there a president in Mexico at the time? I'm going to say yes.
Yes, there was a Mexican president. Okay,
just wanted to make sure. I didn't know. I don't know the the political makeup of Mexico in 1914. So somehow it makes it down to the president in Mexico, and they agree, right? I mean, what are Mexicans gonna get on ships and go over to Europe and fight the Americans there? No, they're probably gonna start fighting, along the Rio Grande. Like they're gonna fight the war on the home front, because there's no way that they're gonna be able to. First of all, there's no way that they're going to get over, right? Not saying that they don't have ships, but the U.S. just would probably sink them all on the way over there. I don't really know. Again, I don't know much about the political makeup of Mexico in 1914, but something tells me that they weren't an economic powerhouse able to project their forces across the globe. I don't know. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
All right, let's just put it this way. America wasn't the world power like it is today at that time. But it definitely was a power in the world and more powerful than Mexico, and that never would have been a successful military campaign. And it's ridiculous to think that that would be anywhere close to a real threat. This war, you could even really make this argument about the war that peace was about to break out even before the U.S. entered World War I, because the war was a stalemate. The soldiers on all sides were sick, they were freezing, and they were on the verge of mutiny. And, without the help of conscripted American soldiers, it's much more likely that the Allies would have negotiated sooner, and they probably would have demanded less vengeful terms.
Well, yeah, if it ended in a stalemate, and the terms that that they did settle on was very vengeful. So you're talking about the Treaty of Versailles here, and I think there's no other way to look at it, but it forced the Germans to accept the entire blame for the entire war, regardless of all the things that we talked about earlier. And what was really important about that, it wasn't necessarily the blame, it was the reparation that the Germans had to pay for it. So this caused, the German government at the time to turn on the money printing process. And that led to terrible hyperinflation. And it totally wrecked the German economy. It basically doomed the fledgling, democratic Weimar Republic in Germany, which was a pretty progressive state. And, well, maybe it could have been great, but we'll never know. But basically in this time, if they hadn't destroyed the German economy, you could probably make the argument that Hitler wouldn't have been able to seize power, because Hitler's entire propaganda program was based on the idea of getting back at the folks that put together the Versailles Treaty, and nationalist shit like restoring dignity to Germany and stuff like that, because they were legitimately humiliated after World War One. But you can probably make an argument that World War II might not have happened under the circumstances that World War II happened. Maybe it still would have happened in a different way.
I think it's almost conclusive that World War II wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, the Treaty of Versailles was the direct lead up to World War II. Like, World War II was a consequence of these war reparations on Germany and annexing territory and German hyperinflation and the delegitimatization of the German
the German
political leadership after World War One, because they were seen
Also,
as
the
traitors.
demilitarization too. They weren't able to really have a standing army to
Everything
defend
that
themselves.
Treaty of Versailles did directly led to the rise of Hitler. Also, not only that,
The Treaty of Versailles was the reason why he didn't get accepted into art school. I'm sure that's probably one of those consequences.
the Treaty of Versailles also led to all of the future Middle Eastern conflicts. It was one of the probably the worst treaty of the 20th century that has done the most harm in the world. But let's pull this back to America, and I guess the major points we want to hit today of the consequence for Americans, civilians, due to this war. So something we spoke about earlier. We made some jokes about Antifa and Proud Boys.
Mm-hmm.
After the U.S. declared war against Germany in April of 1917, a bunch of these hardcore vigilante organizations started springing up, and I actually have a list of these names, and tell me what they sound like. So there is the Knights of Liberty, American Rights League, Boy Spies of America.
That sounds very weird. Keep
Boy
going.
Spies of America.
That makes me feel slightly uncomfortable.
American Defense Society, Sedition Slammers, National Security League, and the Terrible Threateners.
The Terrible Threateners.
The Terrible Threateners. Boy Spies of America.
Yeah, that one's really creepy. I don't know why. It gives off like weird pedo vibes in a way, I don't know. That makes me feel uncomfortable.
Well, all these names kind of make me feel a bit uncomfortable. But the goal was to ensure that the average American had, was fully participating in the war effort. And, they did this through measures of just, intimidation and harassment, surveillance, spying, ratting people out, and then just like outright violence as well. The largest one of these groups was called the American Protective League, the APL. And it had a network of branches of around in 600 cities within America. And, this was a group that had the explicit endorsement of Wilson, of the Wilson administration, and they would collude with the police, and they would go on raids with the police and federal agents, and they would basically beat people up and arrest people. So they did this thing called slacker raids. So in New York City, they did a slacker raid, and the police, the APL, and federal agents, they arrested 75,000 suspected draft dodgers, or if not full out arrested them, or at the very least brought them in to be questioned.
They stopped and frisked them.
They stopped and frisked 75,000 suspected draft dodgers.
That's nuts.
That is just crazy. Like talking about using a paramilitary force.
Do you remember the period over which they did this? Like over what period? Was it like a year or 2 years or something like that?
It was during the war. It was the 10 months in the war. So
like
1917.
200 days?
Yeah. I mean, the U.S. wasn't in the war very long.
I wonder if that like exceeds the rate at which we were doing stop and frisk.
I don't know what the rate is in stop and frisk, but
it was pretty high, but I wonder because that number sounds super high. 75,000 in 200 days. I mean, for context, 75,000 divided by 200 is like 375 stops or arrests per day. That sounds high even for stop and frisk.
What do you think of the unrelated note? What do you think of the chances of something like that being placed in NYPD again?
What, like a draft dodging
No,
slack raid?
A stop and frisk.
Oh, geez. Well, I hope zero.
I mean, I hope so too.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't even want to think about it. Like, I hope zero. Stop and frisk sucked, and it didn't work. And yeah, it just sucked. Talk about infringement on civil liberties, right?
I agree. I think it was a pretty terrible policy. But so the Sedition Act. Let's talk about the Sedition Act. The primary tool of oppression for the U.S. government was the Sedition Act, and it was passed into law in May of 1917, so right after the war, and it prohibited, and I quote, any disloyal, profane, scurrilous. Am I reading that word right? Scurrilous.
Scurrilous.
I should have looked up the definition. Use scurrilous in a definition. Scurrilous. Scurrilous. Scurrilous in a definition, please. Scurrilous. I'm assuming that scurrilous means like rebellious or troublesome. Or abusive language about the form of government or constitution, or flag of the United States, or the uniform of the Army or Navy.
But not the Space Force, because the Space Force uniform is basically just biting off the Air Force uniform. You can make fun of those.
Yeah, sure. But, I mean, beyond the obvious attack on free speech, the very vagueness of the statute definitely lent itself to be abused. And it didn't really take violent or hyperbolic speech to even be arrested. So someone was arrested for just writing this. This was a Morgan War, meaning J.P. Morgan War, and not a war of the people.
Yep.
That was enough to get someone arrested for 3 years. Just writing that.
Dude, we would have been arrested 3 years ago at this point if that was the case now.
Yeah, us and like everyone we've ever collaborated with or had on the show would all be in jail.
Or anyone that we've ever drawn as like resources or, so, things like that.
Like if you looked at my Kindle, I would just be immediately thrown in jail.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, there would be no Moon of Alabama.
Well,
there was no such thing as Moon of Alabama.
I mean, a lot of the internet wouldn't even be a thing if this was the case. Like most of the internet.
If the internet would be totally censored. If the internet was an invention in 1917 during World War I, it would totally be completely censored, and it would be like it would be more controlled than the CCP.
At least they'd try.
they would try. War is the health of the state. Another guy who was arrested was this very prominent socialist leader, Eugene Debs. And, he was delivered. He was speaking at Canton, Ohio, and he was put in jail. He was arrested with a 10-year sentence in federal prison for an anti-war speech.
He was doing an anti-war speech. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another guy who would be arrested in World War I have a quote from our friend Danny Sherson,
Danny Sherson would definitely be arrested in 1917.
Danny Sherson would definitely be arrested during World War I. For I don't know what he would be charged with all types of stuff. But he wrote a really good essay on this, and I'm stealing a quote from him. He said that the Sedition Act needed to be used so broadly deflates the myth that Americans rushed en masse to recruiting stations and waged war with great enthusiasm. In reality, when the government called for 1 million military volunteers, only 73,000 enlisted. 6 weeks later, the United States settled on conscription. Throughout the war, 330,000 Americans were officially classified as war evaders, and thousands of pacifists were detained in so-called conscious objector prison camps.
Conscientious objector prison camps. And yes, that's freaking nuts.
It is
nuts. 330,000 Americans? That's crazy. It's not like... I mean, that's like 10% of our population today, right? 330K times 10. 3.3. No, it's like 1%. But still, it's a ridiculous number.
Come on, Danny. Don't you math?
I can't math on the fly, man. Okay? That's why we have computers. At least I recognize that 3.3 looked like a number that I can divide by 10.
That's close. I think we have somewhere around 300 million people in this country. I think
it was 330 million.
I can come up with a real good percent or ratio right now. But let's talk about the Espionage Act for a bit too, because that's what we started with.
Yeah.
So
for sure.
Upon entry into the war, the Wilson administration proposed the Espionage Act to Congress, and Congress, shortly passed it. And what the law criminalized were newspapers, journalists, really anyone writing or in the media sphere who opposed the war, or even really just questioned the official narrative, or encouraged dissent. So a weird thing that was part of the Espionage Act during World War I was that university professors who were bilingual were recruited to monitor foreign language publications to find materials that may fall under the Espionage Act.
Academic snitches.
I mean, we still have those today. One of the most ridiculous people at this time was the Postmaster General, Albert Burleson, and what he did is he banned anti-war publications from the mail outright. And this was obviously before the internet. And so if your publication or newspaper is banned, or your magazine is banned from its readers, and there's just no way that your content... I want to
underscore that because the mail was exactly how they were delivering it, through the mail. Right? So it's not so much that they just banned the publication, it's just it's like shutting the internet off.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that was their version of shutting down the internet, just stopping the mail from flowing. The mail never stops, Jerry. The mail never stops. What's that from?
Yeah, you got me.
You're not... I don't want to say you're not good at movie quotes or TV
You're just
show
not
quotes.
good at the same movie quotes.
I really throw in some esoteric quotes or TV references, but that was from Seinfeld. The correct answer was Seinfeld.
Lost 100 points.
When Jerry asked Newman why so many mailmen turn into serial killers, he's like, Jerry, it's because the mail never stops. The mail never stops. I'm sure
the mail almost stopped under the Trump administration. Didn't we want to shut that shit down?
It didn't actually stop. I'm sure for the 10 people who got that reference, or maybe it's much more, make sure you rate and review the podcast and say, hey, I knew that you were doing a Seinfeld reference before you even said it. All right, back to the Espionage Act. So one of these magazines that was actually banned was The Nation magazine, which, has always had a reputation for being, kind of a leftist paper. Now it's just like The Nation magazine's pretty much just like neoliberal garbage now, but it's at one point it was kind of it was a principled leftist publication that criticized the U.S. foreign policy enough where it was taken out of circulation. The Espionage Act is what Obama used to wage his war on leakers. including Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden.
Mm-hmm.
The Espionage Act is also, Trump, Obama's not the only one who did this. The Trump administration, they followed that up by bringing charges against Julian Assange, using the Espionage Act. But they did stop short of indicting WikiLeaks, because, if they indicted WikiLeaks, then that would just be kind of game over.
Well, maybe don't lose hope. Maybe Biden will do it.
Maybe Biden will.
No, it'd be game over because it would set a precedent that you could outright bring charges against any publication that publishes literally anything that the government does and that was once or at any point considered classified information. So, when we go back to the episode that we did on the Pentagon Papers, Ellsberg, he gave the information that he had that he photocopied by hand to the Washington Post and the New York Times, and they both printed it. And when we were talking in the last episode about, the Afghan diaries or the Iraq War diary, those leaks were provided to the New York Times, as well as Der Spiegel and a few other publications as well, in advance to vet them and then ultimately publish them. So if you can go after WikiLeaks for leaking things, then you can go after pretty much anyone who does this. And the danger here is that we would never be able to know all of these dirty little secrets that the government's trying to lock up against us and all the ways that they lie us into senseless wars that ultimately claim people's lives, primarily ours, but so the millions of foreign lives that we take in pursuit of wars that are unjustified and largely illegitimate. That's the precedent that it sets. So thanks, Trump, for not going after WikiLeaks.
Yeah, but also, fuck you for not giving Julian Assange a pardon, which I think that's right, appropriate. Mm-hmm. But yeah, don't get your faith in any U.S. president to do the right thing when it comes to this. You can just hope they don't take a mile and only take a couple of inches at this point.
Right.
But back to Wilson. Another big part of this this assault or this this weird kind of tyrannical North Korea type state, this 10-year period in America where we were North Korea, was the propaganda campaigns that were coming out. And so the Wilson administration, they established a department called the Committee on Public Information, which was, it is what it sounds like. It was just a giant propaganda department. And if you ever look at these old World War I propaganda pamphlets, they're really something. They're very interesting. I've always been interested in these because my grandparents used to have them. They used to have a bunch of these old World War I. Yeah, both. Neither of my grandparents were obviously alive during World War I. That would be. Actually, my grandfather on my dad's side was born in 1910. He had my dad very late.
He would have been like 4 years old. So
he would have been 4 years old. So he wasn't really collecting the.
So it was like post-war memorabilia, basically.
Yeah,
like
post-war. I try to collect things that are propaganda. It's kind of a weird fetish I have, is like looking at like very nationalistic type newspaper publications and kind of collecting them and preserving them for the future to show like, hey, like look at this crazy time. Like I have this New York Post article of this soldier, like right after the Battle of Fallujah. You know how like the New York Post always has very entertaining headlines, and it's just like a guy smoking a cigarette. It's just smoking, and It's like Marlboro Man
Smoking.
kicks ass in Fallujah. That's what the headline is.
Super weird.
Very weird. But when I first saw that in 2003, I was like, holy, this is fucking awesome. Like, this is so cool. I was like, yeah.
So you saved it.
Yeah, I have it framed in my room. I preserved it. I framed it. That's how, because I collected it, and my mom's like, hey, Henry, I remember you really liked this, and she framed it for me, so now we have it hanging up.
Oh, that's nice.
But back to, I mean, if you look at like the old World War One propaganda, it was basically just like, buy war bonds, and then it was depicted the Hun as like a beast, or as a monster, or as usually it was like a raging ape, is how they depicted like the German military, like very militaristic.
Weren't there like a bunch of like weird like depictions of German troops being like weirdly threatening to like white American women?
Yeah, I think so. Just type in Google, say U.S. World War One propaganda. Should have probably came prepared for this. So there's one that's just says, destroy this mad brute. And it's just, yeah, you're right. It's just this large King Kong looking ape with a white woman in his hand, and he has a big bat.
Yeah, I see that one.
Screaming.
I mean, I guess this must have slipped my mind, but the biggest one coming out of this is the Uncle Sam pointing at you saying, I want you for the U.S. Army.
Yeah, that is a pretty iconic one. And it's a pretty badass one, too. Uncle Sam is pretty badass.
He's very accusatory.
He's like, what are you doing, you lazy fuck? Get up, grab a gun, and fight and kill for your country. That's what he's saying. I mean, I would be convinced.
Oh, here's a cool one. It's like a fucking panther, and it's like, it's on fire or something like that, and it's like, treat 'em rough, join the tanks. That one's cool.
Treat 'em rough. Oh, yeah. That is pretty cool. Let's see. We have some other ones.
Here's a good one. Hold on. Soldiers eat babies. And it's like a German soldier eating a baby.
Soldiers eat babies? Man, what a great way to tie in the beginning of our
I know, right? I didn't choose that. You see it?
What a great way to tie in the beginning of this episode when we were talking about Obama's birthday party.
Soldiers eat babies.
Oh my god, was this real?
I have no idea. I'm just like scrolling through the pictures.
I don't think this is real. I think this is from a video game.
Oh, lame.
I know, that sucks.
Lame.
So,
what video game is it from? I'm curious.
It's called Team Fortress.
I've heard of it, but never played it.
There's an article that says, Team Fortress 2 poster mistaken for U.S. propaganda on Russian state television.
That's hilarious.
I knew I wasn't fooled. I did not think that was real. That's too outside of the theme. I would have saw
too perfect.
That. It's just too ridiculous. It's too graphic. I don't think that they would have
Soldiers
actually
eat babies.
published that. Soldiers eat babies. But if you type in soldiers eat babies, you'll see a man. It kind of reminds me of the was it Saturn eating his son?
No, what it looks like is Attack on Titan.
Oh yeah,
it looks like a Titan like munching down on a baby. Except the Titan is a soldier.
World War One. Let's see what other World War One propaganda is there. Step in your place. That's a good one.
Now I want to make sure that all the ones we talk about are real. There's one that I'm looking at. It says, "Gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy." And it's like this girl in like a Navy uniform. And then it says, "Be a man and do it. United States Navy recruiting station." That one's probably real.
The World War II propaganda was pretty crazy too. Someone said this to me the other day, or no, I was watching The Sopranos with my fiance, and she laughed at this part because there's a scene where someone said, "Hey, loose lips sink ships," and I think that is directly from World War II propaganda, where it's like don't discuss naval tactics or whatever. You might kill U.S. sailors. But my fiance was laughing at it because like her grandfather used to always say that, hey, loose lips sink ships. So, and I don't know really the origins of that saying, if it came directly from the World War II propaganda at the time, but it's definitely something that has stuck around and that we continue to say.
Yeah, these are super cool.
Beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. So there's like this huge incentive of buying the war bonds.
Mm-hmm.
And then you should also look at the ones not only depicting the, the barbaric Hun, but also look at the ones of how they portray the French. So like U.S. World War I propaganda with the British. Because the British even had their own version of this too. If you look at John Bull. Because John Bull was kind of just like a rip. Uncle Sam was kind of a rip-off of John Bull.
Mm-hmm.
John Bull's kind of the Winston Churchill-y looking guy who's like this fat guy with a turncoat with the British with the British flag, and then he says, "Who's absent?"
Yep, I'm looking at it now.
But it kind of a lot of those they're kind of were copied from, because the British propaganda system was also pretty. I mean, all the propaganda system. I don't want to single out just the Allies. The German propaganda system was horrible too. All these states were bad. They were all nasty governments that were willing to sacrifice a million of generation, for basically banks, for money and personal profit and land and nothing that made any real sense. So none of these states were good. They were all bad. It was just more about governments abusing their citizens, abusing.
Yeah, I mean, there was this one bit about like the rational arguments and against the war. I forget exactly who was making these arguments. It was somebody, I think, that was running against Wilson, or it might have been his Secretary of State. I don't know. I'm forgetting this because I read a million things before this, but they were basically saying that the arguments, for the war was that there was this democratic society, and all the allies were the Democrats, or not the Democrats, but like democratic states, free states, basically, against the, evil authoritarian, Axis powers. And what was weird about that was that the Russians were on the Allied side for this one, and they had an empire. So how does that hold up? How does that line of argumentation hold up?
I'm sorry, I just missed that. I apologize for that.
All good. The whole arguments for going into the war, once again, is just like we are fighting for freedom inside of Europe, and we're joining a bunch of other nations that are freedom loving and like democratic and stuff like that, and the Germans and the and their allies are all authoritarian and basically dictocratic, and the weird part about that was that the Russian army, the Russian Empire, was on the Allied side for this war.
Oh yeah, okay, sorry. I for some reason I blanked and wasn't following that. Well, yeah, I mean they were ruled by the Tsar, an unpopular Tsar, and
right.
He was deposed because of just mainly the there was already a huge problem with like wealth disparity in Russia, and the war where, a large portion of their soldiers weren't even armed with like shoes.
They didn't have shoes?
Yeah, man.
Jeez.
The soldiers in the Russian Imperial Army, like, towards the latter half of the war, they didn't have enough like guns and rifles for the amount of soldiers they had. So,
I guess they figured they'd pick them off the dead bodies ahead of them.
That's exactly what the strategy was, is that you would grab a gun from a fallen soldier. And, there's stories about Russian soldiers not having boots marching into battle. It was just an awful situation that eventually led to a huge collapse in the creation of the Soviet Union. But that was something too that was Wilson's fault. Too. What's that?
So World War I helped with that too.
It did. And Wilson, after the Tsar collapsed, the provisional government there, he tried to bribe he did bribe the provisional government in Russia state war, and that was incredibly unpopular, which gave further power to the Bolsheviks who rose up. So that was another big mistake from the Wilson administration. He inadvertently created Hitler and, Lenin, Trotsky, and the eventual Stalin.
Socialists.
So these...
That's an interesting take, dude. It was all Wilson's fault.
It all. I'm glad you came to that conclusion. It's all Woodrow Wilson's fault.
I'll never look at him the same way again.
Well, that's what you took the words out of Scott Horton's mouth. I don't know if you ever heard him say that, but he says it all the time.
I didn't hear this in particular. But
no, he says it all the time. He's like, it's all Wilson's. It's all Woodrow Wilson's fault. Because in the libertarian community, there's an argument that's always
because of the taxes.
What's that?
Because of the taxes.
Well,
among many
in
other
the
things,
war,
of course.
The debate in the libertarian community between who's the worst president comes down to Woodrow Wilson and FDR. I take the side of Woodrow Wilson being worse than FDR.
Yeah, agreed.
I mean, FDR did a lot of...
Especially now after learning
huge infringements on civil liberties, too. But I think that nothing compares to Wilson and, that 10-year period and all these kind of curses that administration brought upon the world.
A plague on all of our houses.
The plague on the world. And we're not even scratching the surface. I mean, I'm just hoping to introduce my hatred for Woodrow. I'm just trying to share my hatred of Woodrow Wilson. So you all look it up too. And you're like, oh man, he really was an awful human being who looked like Herman Munster. You ever see a picture of him? He was also the ugliest president. He was not to be very superficial, but he's just a haunting looking man. He looks like the crypt keeper.
I'm going to look up ugliest U.S. president and see if he pops up. Let's see. Who the hell is this? Why don't I recognize these presidents?
Because you ignorant.
Some really old pictures. I mean, they're like the old ones, like the black and white, like cross-eyed looking dudes.
The hottest president is Rutherford Hayes.
Rutherford Hayes? Let me see.
I'm joking. I don't even know what he looks like. All right.
No, he kind of looks like Ulysses S. Grant a little bit, to be honest.
All right. We're just rambling on and just talking about nonsense right now. Should we end this episode before we just...
yeah, sure. Tell us in the comments on your reviews who you think was the hottest president and who you think was the nottest president. That would be cool.
Who was the ugliest president and who was the most attractive president? I think Woodrow Wilson was the ugliest. I think the most attractive U.S. president was, it's probably JFK.
I mean, he was the youngest, so kind of an easy.
It's either JFK and I'm no fan of Bill Clinton or Bill Clinton. I think it's probably JFK.
Yeah. I'm gonna go with that too.
Oh, let's go with JFK. Yeah, let's not say Bill Clinton is the hottest anything. It's a bad look. Real bad. Really don't want to be caught. Out of all the things that you could be recorded saying, I think that would probably be the last thing I'd want to be held against me. All right.
That they pull out.
Thanks everyone for listening to another episode of Bro History. I hope you like it when we fly off the rails. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes we just want to just chit chat and we hope that you guys find it entertaining. If you want to support the show, you can rate and review the podcast. Rating and reviewing the podcast is the number one way to support our show. You can also support us on Patreon. And Patreon access gets you access to our Slack account where we developed a cool community where we talk and chat, and it's I enjoy it. I really do look forward to hearing people, talk on the Patreon and talking to everyone. But anything else to add before we wrap this one up, before we completely ramble? See, these summer months, this is when this is rambling season, because usually the dehydration kicks in because it's hot as hell in this small apartment in Brooklyn and the AC is off. So you get a little delusional by the end. You're
doing it as we speak.
Doing it as I speak.
You're doing it right now.
What's the deal with peanuts on airlines? All right. All right.
All right, I'm done. Peace.
All right. Peace.